Today, I'm going to talk some about nutrition, which is kind of, maybe something that some of you already have some good knowledge of. And what I talk about today is going to be pretty basic, but I'm going to do two units, two times talking about nutrients because I feel like they're important to understanding health is really vital, and also it's kind of comes into understanding how plants work medicinally as well. So this time I'm gonna talk about macronutrients. Next time I'm gonna talk about micronutrients. And after that, we'll move on to talking about some specific plant families and patterns that you find in those plant families and things like that. Some more botanical type of stuff. But first I'm going to talk about a couple of verbs. I've been liking the pacing of doing that at the beginning of the class. The first one I want to talk about is blue cohosh. Blue cohosh is a member of the buttercup family. It's Caulophyllum thalictroides is its Latin name, and blue cohosh is the name that it goes by in commerce. It is a sort of lower dose herb. It's not something like some of these herbs that we've talked about, like chamomile and nettle and mint and so forth, are things that you could not really very easily take a harmful dose of. That's not really true with blue cohosh. It's strong medicine, and it is something that you could take too much of. And most of what I do with blue cohosh is for the endocrine system. It does have some other traditional uses. For example, the root being crushed up and used as a poultice on snake bites, but nobody ever comes to see me with snake bites. And they're not, so common, and I'm not so sure how well it works with them because I haven't talked to many people who have had the opportunity to use it on a snake bite. I have talked to a few people who have, but the outcomes of snake bites are really variable in general. So it's hard to say that, the fact that a snake bite didn't cause any problems with blue cohosh poulticed on it might very well mean that the snake didn't inject any venom, and that it would have been the same or similar if you hadn't put blue cohosh on it. So it's hard to say from just a few cases whether it's making whether it's having a consistent benefit or not. But I use it a lot for the reproductive system, for the endocrine system in general, really, but especially the reproductive parts of the endocrine system. And it's pretty good for that. It's pretty helpful for that. So usually when I'm using blue cohosh, I'm using it in tincture form. Oil extracts of it are also traditional, but a lot of people don't like to take oil extracts. So tincture works pretty well. The root is the part that's used. The root has to be gathered late in the summer or early in the fall when the leaves have started to wilt and the fruit on the plant has ripened. So when blue cohosh first starts to grow, it has a bluish tinge to the leaves, and they open up, and then it grows to its full height pretty slowly because it grows in a dark part of the woods. It tends to grow under full shade, under mature hardwood trees. So it grows in a pretty dark part of the woods, and so it grows very slowly because it's only getting what little sunlight filters down to where it's at. And yeah, it's green. It's like light green with a sort of a dusty finish to it that makes it look a little bit bluish. So the root taken in tincture, I usually use between 1 and 5 milliliters a day. And it does a lot of stuff to sort of help the endocrine system regulate itself. It doesn't really contain anything specifically like human hormones, but it does contain some steroidal things that probably interact with the hormone receptors in your endocrine system. In other words, they probably plug into the signaling pathways in your body that are meant for hormones. So it kind of takes their place or acts in a way that's analogous to them, and it tends to stimulate different glands in the glandular system, in the endocrine system. So for instance, I have used this for people who were in a hypothyroid state, who were not producing enough thyroid hormones, and had it get to where their body was producing enough thyroid hormones. In one particular person who refused to take any animal-based or synthetic medicines for personal reasons, this person didn't have a thyroid anymore, but her body was able to produce enough T3 and T4 for her to be close to normal range, not quite in normal range, but close to normal range, even though she no longer had a thyroid, because there are other glands in the body that can produce those substances, the adrenal glands and the ovaries or testes in a person who has them. So it actually was able to sort of address that deficit that happened as a result of her thyroid having been ablated, having been destroyed, because she had a tumor on it. So she no longer had a thyroid, but her body was able to kind of keep up with the help of blue cohosh. So that's I consider that a really interesting case that was able to happen at all. Most of the time when I'm using blue cohosh, I'm using it to help people to be more fertile. So if someone has an irregular menstrual cycle and you give them blue cohosh on if they start a period, or maybe it's not quite a period, but if they start bleeding and you have them take blue cohosh from that day for 14 days and then stop for 14 days and then take it again for 14 days, it will often get them to start having a 28-day menstrual cycle, which often also results in them ovulating and being able to conceive. So in people who are going for that sort of thing, it can be really helpful. It doesn't work every time. It doesn't work for every person, but it's something that does seem to work a lot of the time. And it's low cost, it's low risk compared to things like IVF or other fertility treatments. It's fairly easy on your body. It doesn't throw everything else out of balance the way that some other treatments can. So it's treatments and procedures can. So it's pretty gentle, and costs about $25 a month if somebody's paying full price for tinctures from me. So it's not a very expensive intervention, which can matter a lot in that type of scenario. So that's something that I've used blue cohosh for quite a bit. It can also be used to induce labor in someone whose body is just about there anyway. I've never really tried to use it to induce early, but in somebody who is basically at full term or close to it, it will sometimes taking 5 milliliters of the tincture and then maybe waiting a couple hours, 3 hours, and then doing it again. And then sometimes even a third time. I haven't really done it more than that, but that will often get labor to start in people who are trying to get that to happen. So that's something that I've done a lot of times, and it's pretty consistent. It's again, not 100% of the time, but the majority of the time, much more than 4/5 of the time, I would say. 90-something% of the time, if I had to guess, but I haven't actually kept track of it. But it usually works, and I think usually working is a pretty good standard to hold the treatment to. So that's one of the more frequent things that I've used blue cohosh for. Blue cohosh is not interchangeable with black cohosh. They're related plants and they have related properties, but they're not really the same thing, and they're not super closely related. They're not in the same genus or anything, but they do have some related properties. Black cohosh is more well known for its use in hot flashes and other menopause-related symptoms. And blue cohosh can sometimes help with those things too, but it's not necessarily, it's not really the same. In lower doses, like 1 to 2, or maybe 1 to 3 milliliters per day, I often use blue cohosh as part of an adaptogenic compound. It's especially for older people who are experiencing a lot of fatigue and not necessarily, if they're having a lot of lack of appetite, dry mouth, dry eyes, just kind of dry constitution in general, and low energy, it will often help with that, especially if they're having not much sleep and then not much energy, which is a very common thing to see in older folks, say, 70 plus age range. I mean, of course, it happens in all different age ranges that people have insomnia and fatigue, but when people get older and their bodies stop producing as much melatonin, then they just don't get tired as much, but they don't get energized as much either. So it's like they're physically fatigued, but mentally not sleepy most of the time. And that's a very common thing to see in elderly people. And so that's something that blue cohosh is good for. Usually if I'm using blue cohosh for that, I'm using it as part of a compound, but it can be used by itself. But it's something that is good for that, sort of a tonic property or an adaptogenic type of property that it has. Just a second. Do you have a question? Would blue cohosh be useful for someone who's had a complete hysterectomy but wants to stop taking hormone replacement therapy? It might. So blue cohosh does sort of help other organs and other glands take up the slack for ones that are no longer present. But so sometimes it does help with that. Yes, it kind of, for me, it would depend a lot on what the presenting symptoms were. But because sometimes blue cohosh is stimulating the uterus to produce estrogen, things like that. But or at least I think that's what it's doing. But it can help some with other glands sort of making up for the ones that aren't there anymore, other organs making up for the ones that aren't there anymore. But it would depend a lot on what the presenting symptoms were. So like, for instance, with things like night sweats and hot flashes and stuff like that, I would be more likely to go for something that contained isoflavones like red clover. But the blue cohosh might be something that I would use along with that. Partridge berry is another one that I've often used in that scenario. And I don't think we've even talked about partridge berry really. It's a pretty environmentally sensitive plant, but it's a good tonic for the reproductive system. So yeah, it would probably have some beneficial effect in that situation, but I probably wouldn't use it by itself. And exactly what I would use would depend a lot on what the person was experiencing. So there are other things I might use for instance, keeping up bone density, for helping with sleep, for replacing some of what the estrogen might have been doing in the body. Yeah, for someone who's fairly young in that situation, I would probably do a combination of something like red clover, maybe along with something like blue cohosh or maybe ginseng. And yeah, it can that can show up in a lot of different ways. One of the main things that you would be concerned about in somebody in that scenario is bone density over the course of their life, because having less estrogen in their system would mean less calcium could mean less calcium getting deposited into bones, which is a bigger deal if it's starting earlier in your life than if it's starting later in your life, because you have more time for your bones to get weak. So yeah, replacing that with isoflavones from plants would be a good first step. And then it would probably also be, smart for somebody like that, regardless of whether they're on replacement hormones or whether they're on something else, to have some extra vitamin D and calcium and things like that. So, it would be potentially a little more of a complicated thing that I don't want to just give a off the shelf answer for, but those are some of the strategies that I might use in approaching that.
Thank you. Sorry, it was a complicated question.
No, it's fine. It's fine. Yeah. So any other questions about blue cohosh before I go on to talk about bloodroot? The bloodroot is even more of a low dose herb than blue cohosh. Both bloodroot and blue cohosh are things that grow in the deep woods, in mature hardwood forests around here, both here in central Kentucky and in eastern Kentucky. I think we saw bloodroot when we were out on the herb walk in Garrett County, for those of you who were part of that. And bloodroot is called bloodroot because it has reddish latex that looks a lot like blood. It's actually orange if you sort of smear it out, spread it out a little more, but when it's in a droplet, it looks like a dark red bloodish color, and has about the consistency of blood, the viscosity of blood. So it's a member of the poppy family, and it is it's a pretty strong medicine. A lot of the time, it's a very well-known medicine in Appalachian traditional medicine. Where I'm from, people sometimes dig it and sell it, and that's been a popular source of income for people for many generations. A lot of what they sell these days goes into animal feed in Europe, which is where it's kind of used as sort of an alternative to antibiotics in animal feed. But it has a variety of medicinal properties. The thing that is probably most well known for these days is that if you put it on squamous cell carcinoma, it will burn it off. It will actually dissolve small skin cancer off of the body. If you put it over some other kinds of growth, sometimes it will cause the skin to break open and it will draw things out. So it kind of has a reputation of being able to get foreign objects that are lodged in the body to come to the surface. And from what I've seen, it does seem to be able to do that. And I'm not exactly sure what the mechanism of action behind that is. But it does have, if you have abnormal cells, cancerous cells, or poorly differentiated cells, and you put them on a microscope slide and you put a drop of bloodroot on top of that, it will stain the abnormal cells and not the normal cells. So you can actually, because of the membrane of the abnormal cells is different, cancerous or precancerous epithelial cells, which epithelial cells are kind of like the cells that form the outside surface of the body on the skin and on the mucous membranes, inside the mouth, inside the nose, inside the reproductive tract. So it will actually stain cancerous or precancerous cells and not stain normal cells. And so I think that what is going on in the body when bloodroot is applied to abnormal cells is that those cells soak it up, the normal cells don't, and it kills off the abnormal ones. Now, a lot of the time, bloodroot products have had zinc added to them as sort of a mordant, zinc chloride, which is a salt of zinc. Basically, it's zinc that's been dissolved with hydrochloric acid to form a salt that's water soluble. And that's used as a mordant in the process of dyeing fabrics. So if you wanted to dye yarn with bloodroot and you put this zinc chloride in there, it would make the dye stick to the fabric. And if you use it on the human body, it kind of does the same thing. It makes the substances from the bloodroot stick to all the cells, not just the bad ones. So that is sort of what's called an escharotic salve, and it will burn a hole in the skin, and it will, kind of destroy healthy tissue as well as unhealthy tissue. And that's not necessarily what I'm going for when I use it. And I don't know why that became the more popular way to use it, but there's people call it black salve because it's very dark colored. It's really very dark orangish brown, but usually, it's something that I think at some point became popular. People heard about it and imitated it and so forth. But it's actually, in my practice, I use bloodroot directly as either as an oil extract, because you can make a warm oil infusion out of it, or as a tincture, sometimes mixed with oil. If you put bloodroot tincture and oil together in a blender, it will blend. The latex, the gums in the root will actually help it to emulsify with the oil. But I also make an oil of bloodroot where it's been heated in oil. And today I saw someone who is in their late 80s who had a quarter-sized lesion on one of their hands, and I had them put liniment made of bloodroot oil and oak moss oil on it for a couple months, and it completely went away. And so this was looking at it at 3 months since it was completely gone. So, and it's seemingly stayed completely gone. So that's a pretty neat trick to be able to do. Pretty useful thing to be able to do. Didn't cause any pain, didn't cause any open sore or anything like that. It just made the lesion sort of shrink until it was all the way gone. And I think that that's a really useful thing to be able to do. When bloodroot is applied directly to the skin, it can also reduce pain. It contains some opioids. It doesn't contain morphine or codeine or anything very close to them, but it does contain some other things that are a little bit close to them that are in the same family of substances. And it does appear to be able to work transdermally. It does appear that if you use bloodroot on somebody's skin, either by applying it directly and letting it dry or making a compress of it and putting it on the skin, that it is able to relieve pain. I don't usually use that kind of pain relief, except in people who are probably terminally ill anyway. But it is a way to get pain relief without having to swallow anything additional, because a lot of the time people in that situation are taking as many things internally or taking more things internally than they would like to be taking anyway. What was in it again? The liniment. The liniment contained 2 oil infusions. One was of bloodroot and one was of a lichen called oak moss. Either one by itself might have worked, but I like using both together because then I'm kind of hedging my bets, and whichever one gets the job done, the job gets done. So yeah, bloodroot tincture applied to the skin, or bloodroot latex if you have the fresh root applied to the skin, may cause some irritation of the skin, especially if it's done repeatedly on the same spot, but usually does afford some relief from severe pain. And that relief does often come with some sedation or some, it makes people feel a little bit out of it because it is a very strong type of medicine. I don't really use bloodroot internally very much. It does have a history of use for dental stuff, for oral stuff, where it will do sort of the same thing to mouth bacteria as it does to abnormal cells, which is bind to their membrane and make them too alkaline to continue functioning. And it also stains the plaque on your teeth so you can see where it is. But repeated use of it can also cause irritation in the mouth. So I don't really use it for that, or at least I have used it for that. I don't use it for that very much. I've used bloodroot mouthwash. I've used bloodroot in a mouthwash along with some other ingredients for when people have open sores in their mouth, to disinfect them and to help them heal up. Basically help to get the bacteria out of them so that they're able to close. And I usually use other things for that. My sort of threshold for when I use bloodroot is if you can see bone where you shouldn't be able to see it. In other words, somewhere other than somebody's teeth. If you can see bone, then then it's time for extreme measure. And mostly that's something that I see in either people who have radiation treatments for head and neck cancer, or people who use cocaine, especially in a smokable form. Both of those things can cause really bad oral hygiene situations, because the radiation thing sort of destroys the immune cells in the area and gives the bacteria more free reign. And then the cocaine is just sort of caustic to the tissue, as well as probably changing the pH and probably being associated with just, not the best self-care habits. But I've used it in both of those situations for people who had ulcerative gingivitis with exposed bone, which is a very early situation that can turn into a dangerous situation if the person starts to become septic. So, be aware that that is potentially a dangerous situation if you see it, and advise people that it is. But the bloodroot as an additive to mouthwash or as an ingredient in mouthwash, especially along with thyme, which is kind of just a very standard antiseptic type of thing, is pretty helpful. And it's also pain relieving, and that's helpful because that situation tends to be pretty painful. So. Okay. All right. So yeah, if you are going to harvest bloodroot or blue cohosh, make sure you're harvesting it at the right time of year when the seeds have ripened and the leaves have started to fade. And make sure that you don't harvest more than 1/10 of the population, or harvest from a population that might be under a lot of pressure from some other source. So if the if the population is struggling to hold on or something like that. Um, but yeah, no more than one plant in 10, and only gather at the right time of year, because you want the plant to be able to reseed itself, and that's only able to happen once the fruits have ripened. An interesting thing about bloodroot is that it's cultivated by ants. Each little bloodroot seed has this thing called herbalism, which is a fleshy piece. It's like a piece of fruit flesh. It feels and tastes like the inside of an apple, but it's just a tiny little bit of it attached to each seed. And ants like it, and so they take it underground with them, and they eat that part of the fruit, and the seed is hard. They don't eat that part, and so then the seed is down underground in the anthill in an aerated space, and it starts growing there. And so it's actually something that ants plant, and then they, or maybe it's their great grandchildren, I'm not sure, harvest it in the fall, months later. So, or sometimes years later, because a bloodroot plant will grow in the same spot for years. It's perennial. And I'm not sure how many years a particular bloodroot plant lives, but several. So that's an interesting little piece of the forest ecosystem that's going on there. This is actually it grows in stands, where it's one of the ways that it propagates is by being cultivated by ants. Question of, do you harvest bloodroot the same time of the year as blue cohosh? They overlap some. On the whole, bloodroot is usually done a little earlier than blue cohosh, but the times when they're harvestable overlap some. And when they get done depends on how much sunlight that particular plant is getting. And bloodroot often grows in a little more sunny of a place than blue cohosh, because bloodroot is often growing along trails or in areas where there's a little bit of a break in the canopy and there's some light streaming through, whereas blue cohosh is not so much. Blue cohosh sometimes grows along streams that have that situation, but it's often growing in the shadiest parts of the woods. So sometimes the bloodroot is done first, but there is some overlap, and you just kind of, if you have a stand of them, you just have to check on them and see when they're done. But it is definitely possible to have the experience of going out in the woods and getting both on the same day. And both of them are very interesting, I don't know, weird plants. The bloodroot has a beautiful flower that has white petals and a yellow center. The flower comes up, starts blooming, and then as the flower is blooming, or sometimes right after, the leaf comes up. So the leaf comes up after the flower. So it's completely flowering off of last year's stored energy. And then the leaf gathers up the energy for the next bloom, for the next time around, over the course of the year. And so it starts coming up before the trees leaf out. It starts very early in the year. It's one of the fairly early things you would see blooming out in the woods. Okay. All right. So I wanted to talk about nutrition and about nutrients in foods. And like I said, we kind of categorize them into two different categories, which I'm going to talk about separately. And the one that I'm going to be talking about today is, oh, sorry, there's a question, is bloodroot common to find here? Yes, it's pretty common in Kentucky. As far as if you find the right habitat for it, you'll often find it. So, and that habitat is a mature hardwood forest that has an intact forest floor. In other words, the forest floor is not covered with an invasive ground cover like winter creeper. So, if you go out to Garrett County, where we were in the woods, that place has lots of it. If you go out to Red River Gorge, there's lots of it. If you go out to the Daniel Boone National Forest, you'll find stands of it. You never find tons of it growing in any one place, but it's not an infrequent thing to find out in the woods at all, especially, like I said, if you find the right habitat. So that the habitat is more the limiting factor than anything. All right, so as far as the nutrients go, yeah, one category of nutrients is macronutrients, meaning stuff that you need a lot of. And that is basically protein, carbohydrates, fats. And then there's also micronutrients, which are things that you need tiny amounts of, where the dosage is more measured in milligrams rather than grams. And that is things like vitamins and minerals. Now, there is a much wider world of substances that people take in through their diet besides just vitamins, minerals, fats, carbohydrates, proteins, and calories. But those are some basic things that everybody needs all the time that we tend to maybe focus a little more on when we're talking about nutrition. So a balanced diet should have lots of different foods in it, should have, lots of different antioxidants, lots of different fruits and vegetables, fresh fruits and vegetables, and things like that. So, I would encourage you to try not to think of it in a very reductive form. There used to be this idea that, so people, first they discovered with plants that they needed nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And then they tried to find something similar with humans and find just like a few specific things that humans could live on, that the human diet could be reduced to. And, it kind of turned out to be a little more complicated than that because we don't photosynthesize. But there are certain things like vitamins and minerals that we have to take in measurable amounts in order to be well. And so that's where people came up with the idea of vitamins. And they also discovered, that there were some different types of nutrients that kind of made up the substance and the energy that our bodies use, and those are the macronutrients. So that's what I'm going to focus on today, is the ones that we are taking in grams and hundreds of grams rather than in milligrams. And also calories. So calories really is best to think of as food energy. Calories are a unit of energy. You could also see the food energy measured in joules. Some places they label food like that. But energy is the ability to do work. It's the ability to move mass across distance. So if you're going to be moving your body or picking things up and moving them around, you're going to be expending calories. And for humans, the only way to get those calories is to eat them. Well, you could get, maybe IV glucose or something like that. But practically speaking, the normal way that we get calories is through eating them. So all this energy in food starts out as sunlight, gets converted during the process of photosynthesis into into food, especially into carbohydrates. And then those carbohydrates sometimes get combined with other substances to make more complex, well, to make fats, to make proteins, and so forth. So, yeah, everybody needs to be taking in carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. It's possible because humans are very adaptable and we're omnivores and we can eat just about any sort of diet without dying immediately. Not to say that it isn't life shortening, but we can do it for a while, as long as we're getting the calories that we need and we're getting enough protein. Usually your body can get by without taking in much of the other stuff. It's possible to have problems from not taking in any fat, but it's very rare in actual practice. It's been done in a controlled diet type of setting where someone just ate lean meat and they eventually got what people sometimes call rabbit starvation, which is where you're just going into a starvation state because you're not getting any fat. But for the most part, as we all know, your body can take calories and make fat. You don't have to eat fat to get fat. You could eat carbohydrates and put on fat because your body's capable of storing energy as fat if you're taking enough energy, for the most part. There can be some difficulties with that. Sometimes people's bodies aren't able to metabolize things, but for the most part, your body is capable of breaking carbohydrates down and making fats out of them. Chemically speaking, fats are sort of the simplest form of food. So fats contain, at a minimum, hydrogen and carbon. And you can have oils that don't contain any substances other than hydrogen and carbon. Carbohydrates contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Proteins contain carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. So for the most part, our human bodies and a lot of other animals' bodies as well are able to do some switching back and forth as far as what form the nutrients are in. You can eat, like I said, you can eat carbohydrates and put on fat. You can't exactly eat carbohydrates and put on protein unless you're also eating protein, but you can break protein down into carbohydrates and into energy. And so if you're getting carbohydrates, you might not have to do that. So all the body's energy is in the form of, let me see how I want to put this. For your body to be able to use a substance as energy, it has to turn it into a carbohydrate first. It has to break it down, or sometimes build it up into the form of glucose first. So that's what your body is basically powering itself on. Even though we're taking in food in other forms, it has to get broken down into that simple form to be able to be used as energy. And energy is sort of the most basic fundamental thing that food will go towards if there's not enough. So there's sort of a priority system in your body that first you have to have enough calories, and second, you have to have enough protein. And then beyond that, your body can start doing different things with the nutrients that you take in. So what sometimes happens is if someone is starving, there are a couple of different kinds of starvation. There's energy malnutrition, which is just where somebody is not taking in enough calories. And then there's protein malnutrition, where somebody's taking in enough calories, but not enough protein. And this would happen if somebody was just living off of grain, for instance. Well, it might happen if somebody was living off of grain. If they were just living off of flour, especially, then they would be likely to develop certain patterns of things like fluid retention and abdominal distension and things like that are recognizable, that are just a matter of not having enough protein, because your body is not able to sort of maintain itself and repair the wear and tear that is going on as your body is being used, unless you have enough protein. And if you have either of those things going on, you're going to have less fat in your body than you need to have. And if your body fat percentage goes below a certain threshold, which is a little bit different for everybody, but it's somewhere around 5% or so, then you start to get into a very critical situation where your nervous system and your endocrine system don't have the building blocks they need to make hormones and neurotransmitters. And then you get endocrine problems and you get mental problems, depression, things like that, just from being malnourished. So that's all horrible. And it's we don't have a lot of famines around here lately, but we do have eating disorders. We do have digestive problems that keep people from absorbing nutrients. We do have age-related loss of appetite and of digestive ability. So it's not, and we also have things like addiction and alcohol consumption that keep people from taking in nutrients and also keep people from absorbing them. So it's not uncommon to see malnourished people at all. It's not uncommon to see malnourishment at all in our culture, even though we're not living in a place where there's as much starvation on a large scale. There is sometimes sort of food scarcity, chronic food scarcity, and that's not that unusual either, where people just maybe they're eating every day but not quite as much as they wish they were, that sort of thing. That is still a common enough scenario, and something that you might encounter in your community if you're working with people. And, as I've said before, when I first got my start as an herbalist, I was doing a lot of free work with homeless people, street people, things like that, and saw a lot of things that are more common in that demographic than they are in the people who usually come to see me at the clinic these days. I will still do see some of the same people. So I wanted to look at a nutrition label. We've all seen them before, right? I mean, they're something that is very common in our culture, and pretty much all food has them. All packaged food has it. So I'm not sure how well you can see this on the camera because my little picture is small, but whenever you see these, I just kind of wanted to look at them and sort of look at some of the things that are on them. So the first thing up here is calories. I mean, above that you have serving size. Serving size is famously often unrealistic on food packaging. But a quarter of a cup of rice, that is possibly, depending on the scenario, might be a realistic amount for somebody to eat. So that's 45 grams of rice, or in other words, about 1/10 of a pound. And there are about 20 servings in this 2-pound bag at that rate. So that much rice, 1/10 of a pound of uncooked rice, which is going to cook up to maybe a quarter of a pound of cooked rice, but the non-water part of it is 1/10 of a pound, and that contains 160 calories. So a normal amount for a person to need over the course of a day is about 2,000 calories. If somebody is very physically active, they might need a couple times that. If somebody was incredibly physically active, like boot camp or something like that, then maybe they would need 5,000 or 7,000. But 2,000 is a pretty normal amount to need for a person who's doing mild to moderate physical activity, let's say. So we always think, a lot of people think of, I shouldn't say we always think of, a lot of people would think of rice as being a carbohydrate. People talk about, you know, different portions of food being carbs, protein, so forth. But it's important to remember that most food contain more than one of those things. So in this situation, we've got in this 45 grams of rice, 36 grams of carbohydrates. So that's total carbohydrates. Total carbohydrates contains basically 3 categories. One is sugars, one is dietary fiber, and one is what might just be called complex carbohydrates. So dietary fiber, they're all the same stuff. It's just that they're different lengths of molecules. Sugar is just like a single unit. Starches, what we usually think of as complex carbohydrates, are several of those, and dietary fiber is dozens or hundreds of units long, dozens or hundreds of sugar molecules strung together into a single molecule. And so dietary fiber we don't really digest, or not much at all anyway. So it's something that provides a substrate for our gut bacteria. It influences the texture of what's moving through our digestive system and the rate at which we're absorbing nutrients from it, and how long it stays in our digestive system, and consistency of stool and things like that. But we don't actually digest the fiber itself. The sugars we absorb pretty quickly, the carbohydrates we absorb more slowly, but both of those are essentially just usable for energy. So that they're mainly just going to go towards calories. They're not going to go towards building muscle. They're not going to go towards repairing injuries or replacing cells or anything like that. So there are also about 3 grams of protein in this 45 grams of rice. So 3 grams of protein is a small amount of what you would need in a day, but it is a significant amount of protein. So, you know, it's basically 12 grams of carbohydrates for every gram of protein in rice. Rice is probably the most consumed food in the world. It's you know, it's the main staple crop for a very large part of the human population, and we know from experience that people can live quite a while on eating just rice and nothing else. It's not ideal, because, you know, eventually you would get to the point of where you are not getting enough of some of the things that you need. But let's say we're going to get, well, let's say you ate this bag of rice every day. Let's say you ate that much rice in a day. You would get, you'd get more than 2,000 calories from it. You'd get 2,320 calories from it, something like that. So, you know, you'd get plenty of calories if you ate this whole bag of rice every day. You'd get about 60 grams of protein, which is pretty decent. That's a decent amount of protein to get in a day. It's not like the ideal amount of protein to get in a day necessarily, but it's enough to be going on with. So, you know, you wouldn't get any fat. This contains 0 grams of fat, but your body would presumably be able to make some fat from those extra calories that were above and beyond what you needed for your energy needs for the day. So, you know, theoretically, if you were just eating 2 pounds of rice a day, you could go on that for quite a while. There's not the vitamins and other nutrients that you would need in it in sufficient amounts. But if you were to supplement it with a little bit of other food, you could get those too. So, it's the fact that grain does contain a pretty adequate amount of proteins and starches, a good combination of proteins and starches, is one of the reasons that grain sort of became the main staple crop in a lot of civilizations, whether that was corn or rice or wheat or whatever, because you do get, if it is all you can eat in the day, if it's all you have left and that's what you have to get through the winter on, you can make it. It's something that is not a complete food, but it's a pretty reasonably well-rounded food. So it's not just a carbohydrate, and that goes not just for rice but for other grains as well. They contain carbohydrates and proteins. And most seeds contain proteins, and grains are a type of seed. They're a relatively starchy type of seed, so they contain more carbohydrates than proteins. Or I should say they contain a large proportion of carbohydrates to proteins. This is a can of beans, also a staple crop throughout much of the world, throughout much of human history. Beans and other things like them, lentils, peas, and so forth, have been one of the things that people grow as a staple crop. Like grains, they can be dried out and kept for months, possibly years at a time. And like grains, they do contain carbohydrates and proteins. So with this can of beans, got about, this is kind of funny. It says 3.5 servings per container, which seems kind of random. I think if I were going to eat beans from a can, I would either eat a whole can of beans or maybe half a can of beans, but not 3.5. I don't know. That's kind of random and specific, really. But I think they picked that serving size to make these numbers come out the way they wanted them to be. So in this case, the whole can, if we look at the whole can as one serving, which I think is, a fairly reasonable thing, you might not really eat that much. But 3.5 times the 110 calories is going to be 485. So that's quite a bit of calories in one can of beans. And this is not dried beans, this is they're canned, so they've absorbed some water and everything. It's a 15-ounce can, which is kind of standard size can of beans. So in this case, it's got 21 grams of carbohydrates per serving, per that small serving, and of that carbohydrates, 5 grams of that is fiber. So 1 gram of it is sugar. So 5 grams is fiber, which means that the other 16 is something digestible, starches and sugars. 1 gram is sugar, so that leaves the other 15 grams as starches. So 45 grams of starch and 3 grams of sugar, or well, no, not quite even that. But anyway, so this whole can contains 21 grams of protein. So quite a lot more protein than you would get from the bag of rice. I mean, from the serving of rice. So oh no, 24 and a half. I'm forgetting that half a serving in the container. So it's the carbohydrates are merely triple what the protein is rather than 12 times what the protein is. So the mix of protein to carbohydrates is different, is much more shifted towards the protein end of things in the beans than it is in the rice. So that's why when people think of beans, they would often think of them as a protein source, and when people think of rice, they would often think of them as a carbohydrate, even though both of them contain both things. And both of them contain both things in a quantity that's really sufficient for you to live off of. But the beans contain a much larger portion of proteins compared to the carbohydrates. Even so, they contain more carbohydrates than they do proteins, just not by as large of a margin as the rice does. So when you look at how humans cook, a lot of the time what they'll do is they'll combine beans and rice, or they'll combine grains and pulses of some sort. So in doing that, you get a wider range of amino acids potentially. That's something about proteins too. I should back up and explain that. Humans cannot absorb proteins from our digestive tract. I don't know that any animals can. If a foreign protein gets into your bloodstream, you have an allergic reaction to it. You have your body recognizes it as a foreign substance, and you have an inflammatory response to it. So that's not what's supposed to happen. What's meant to happen is that when you eat something that contains protein, your body breaks the protein down into amino acids. And whereas proteins are fairly specific, proteins are long ribbons of amino acids connected to each other. And there are all sorts of different proteins that are fairly identifiable. That might be, for instance, specifically a beef protein or a chicken protein or a human protein. Whereas the amino acids are the same. There are a few dozen amino acids that are common in protein, and the body breaks the proteins down into those, and the amino acids from these various different protein sources look fairly similar or identical to the amino acids that are already in your body, so your immune system doesn't have any sort of reaction to them. An amino acid is what makes an amino acid different from what makes it an amino acid is that it contains nitrogen. Let me put it that way. So the amino part is that it contains nitrogen. It's a nitrogen containing compound. And that nitrogen is taken from the atmosphere by plants. So animals can't make aminos. They take aminos from plants, they recombine them into animal proteins. And then, when we eat other animals or when we eat beans or rice, we break those proteins down back into amino acids and reabsorb them. So ultimately, all the aminos come from plants, and all of the proteins need to get broken back down into aminos before they can be absorbed into the body and then recombined into different proteins, which is a very complicated set of reactions in the body that involve all sorts of different enzymes and pathways and so forth. But that's kind of the long and short of it, is that we're not really absorbing much protein, very, very little at all actually, into our bloodstream. We're absorbing aminos that are broken down proteins, and then we're reassembling them into proteins. So that's something to be aware of. But yeah, so we can get proteins from different plants. We can get them from animals too. Some people do a better job of digesting certain proteins. Some people, of course, have deadly reactions to certain proteins, but it's also very common for, like, for one person to be able to eat tofu and it agrees with them just fine, and somebody else eats it and it makes them, terribly gassy and crampy and things like that. And that has a lot to do with gut bacteria, but it also has to do with what enzymes are in the particular mix that's going into your digestive system, and just how your immune system is responding, whether your body is accidentally absorbing some small amounts of foreign proteins and things like that. So it's always something that you want to look at when somebody's having digestive issues. Are there things that disagree with them? And if there are, it's often proteins. Sometimes it's carbohydrates, and they're just getting kind of gassy because the carbohydrates are fermenting in their digestive tract. But a lot of the time it's proteins that aren't agreeing with them, especially if there's a lot of inflammation involved. Okay, just a moment. So this is sunflower oil. And oil seeds are also a big part of what humans have traditionally grown to keep ourselves from starving to death. And also what we foraged when we foraged. Sometimes they come with protein, like in the case of nuts, sometimes not so much. Sunflower seeds do contain some protein, but a lot of the time the oil is just pressed out of them. So in this situation, I want to look at this nutrition label. So the serving size here is 1 tablespoon, 15 milliliters. So basically a little bit less than 15 grams, because if it were water, it would be 15 grams. 15 milliliters of oil is a little bit less than that, because oil is a little bit less heavy than water. So you remember that 45 grams of this had 160 calories. And then 130 grams of this had 110 calories. Part of that 130 grams is water. So 110 calories in 130 grams. This one has 160 calories in 45 grams. And then this one has 130 calories in just under 15 grams. So a lot of calories per gram, a lot of calories per gram, nearly triple what it is for the rice, and even more than that compared to the beans. So all of that is fat. So, it lists 15 grams of fat as being essentially the weight of it. So it's just pure fat. Oil, cooking oils, edible oils are just basically pure fat. And so they're very calorie dense. High protein stuff is also very calorie dense. So if somebody has a hard time eating because they have a very limited amount of space in their stomach or a very limited appetite, and they just can't swallow that many times before they feel too full, oil can be a good way to get calories into somebody. But your body can only break down 1 or 2 tablespoons of oil at a time. So if you give somebody more than that, it's just going to come out of them undigested, and it's probably going to make everything else slide through them too. But you can definitely digest a tablespoon of oil. And so that's a way to get, as much calories as a serving of rice or a serving of beans in 1 spoonful. Yeah. Oils are a particularly readily available source of a lot of calories, a lot of energy. Fats and oils are essentially the same thing. We use the term lipids to refer to both. The difference between them is essentially the fat is solid at room temperature and an oil is liquid at room temperature. So it's not really a nutritional difference. It's more of just a perceived structural difference. And there are a lot of fats that are, there are a lot of things like, for instance, coconut oil that are solid at room temperature, but liquid at body temperature. So the difference between, you know, the 70 degrees in the room versus the 98 point something degrees in your body is enough to make the difference between it being solid or liquid. So fats are partly structural. They are partly source of substances that your body uses, as, you know, building blocks that it uses for other things. And they are partly a source of energy, a store of energy. So if someone has a lot of adipose tissue, of fatty tissue, which basically consists of little cells that are mostly full of lipids, then they will, then that's something that can be burned for energy should the need arise. It also acts as part of the endocrine system. Fatty tissue produces estrogen and some other hormones, and a lot of hormones are made from cholesterol, which the liver makes out of fat. So the liver can make the fat into cholesterol, and then various different organs throughout the body can make the cholesterol into things like testosterone, estrogen, and so forth. So it is, fats are an important building block for running your body, for running your nervous system and your endocrine system. And they also have, you know, structural functions, mechanical functions, like the fact that if somebody is really skinny, then sitting on a hard surface is going to be harder on their body, for instance, just because, you know, fat can act as a sort of cushioning and that sort of thing. And then, you know, it's also, so people think of it as just being stored energy a lot of the time, but that's a big oversimplification. It does a lot of different things in your body and is useful for a lot of different things. And if there's not enough of it, it can cause some really bad problems. So yeah, so protein, you know, is sort of what a lot of the tissue is made out of in our bodies. So we need protein we need a constant throughput of protein in our bodies to be able to maintain our cells, because any given cell in your body, most of them don't last that long. They're there for a while, then they reproduce themselves, and then the original cell dies and gets broken down. And in order for that process to happen, you need to have the amino acids to build the new proteins out of. And in order to have that, you need to have dietary protein. So, you know, keep in mind that your body can't fix nitrogen from the atmosphere. So you can't turn carbohydrates into protein. Carbohydrates can spare protein by keeping them from being used as energy. Protein can be broken down for energy too. And so if somebody is working more than they're taking in, they'll not only burn fat, they'll burn muscle. And that's just the matter of that tissue being broken down and used for energy. And your body will give priority to that demand for energy, because in a survival situation, you know, if you were not able to exert energy and get food, then of course you would die. So, you know, your body would rather let you run yourself to death than shut down and doom you to starvation because you're not able to go out and obtain more energy. So in our mostly energy rich situation that we find ourselves now, it's important not to run yourself to death. And it's important to keep in mind that you know, that that you're perfectly capable of running yourself to death, and that you mustn't do so if that's not the outcome that you want. Because too often people feel like people overexert themselves and they think that they're going to hit a wall or somehow be unable to keep it up. They think that if they're able to keep it up, then it's just that they're capable of it. But we're actually quite capable of overexerting ourselves for a period of time, because it's just something that our ancestors needed to do sometimes. And, we may find ourselves in situations once or in a while where we need to do such a thing, but not usually. Just a second. Okay. So does that make sense so far? As far as the different types of macronutrients. So as far as energy goes, a lot of the time the situation that people find themselves in our culture right now is that people maybe take in too much energy compared to what they're expending and gain weight. And this can, like I said, have an effect on the endocrine system because adipose tissue is producing endocrine substances, and also because the diet that people have from our staple foods, if you're over consuming them, you're getting a much higher portion of carbohydrates to your calories than what you would get if you were foraging your diet, or if you were, a hunter-gatherer type situation. So so the rice, for instance, going back to that, where it's got 36 grams of carbohydrates to every 3 grams of protein, that's something you wouldn't usually find in nature, or you would find few foods that did that. There would be fruits that had a lot of carbohydrates, but they would also have a lot of protein, and they wouldn't be as concentrated a source of carbohydrates usually. And they would also probably be seasonal, and grains are not seasonal, or they have a harvest season, but you can keep them all year. So what we've had happen in the last few thousand years is you have more and more of the population with more and more of their diet consisting of grains and higher proportion of carbohydrates. And so what you're seeing, especially within our own lifetimes, and especially within the last couple of generations, is that there's been an increase in what we would now call type 2 diabetes. People have had other words for it at other times, like Bright's disease was a description of it that was common during the 1800s, when people were first starting to see kidney damage that was resulting at kidney damage and some other things that went with it. But what they were really seeing in a lot of those cases was kidney damage resulting from high blood sugar, though they didn't necessarily have very good ways of measuring it back then. So you get type 2 diabetes and you get obesity, which puts various different types of strain on the body. And I think it's really important to realize that there is just naturally a whole lot of variation in what the human body looks like. And that, I think people have kind of, at the same time that there's been this increase in how many people are carrying around a lot of extra fat and how many people are having endocrine consequences from eating a high carbohydrate diet, there's been this mostly fashion driven valuation of thinness that that sometimes tries to say that it's about health, but really it's more about looks, and that you can be unhealthy or relatively healthy or unhealthy at any size, pretty much, or most sizes. At extreme ends of either one, it's pretty much consistently unhealthy. But there's a wide range of ways that people's bodies can look, and amounts of body fat and amounts of weight that people can be carrying around without it being inherently a bad thing. So when people talk about body mass index, for instance, sometimes there are some statistical averages that correlate to body mass index, but on the whole, it's not a reliable indicator of anything. It's not necessarily, doesn't necessarily mean that somebody is more or less healthy for them to have a particular body mass index. And I think way too much attention gets paid to that. And like I said, I think that it's mostly driven by the quest for a certain type of look. That's what's popular in current times. But so I think it's much more important that somebody is eating a balanced diet and that they're exercising and things like that than what their body mass index is. But I also do think that it is a thing that can have consequences on people's bodies, and that it's important to notice that the more weight you have, the more strain it is on your joints. The higher glycemic index your diet is, the harder it is on your body's ability to use insulin. And higher glycemic index is kind of a measurement of how much your blood sugar goes up, how quickly your blood sugar goes up when you consume certain foods. So some things like starches have a higher glycemic index. Sugars tend to have a higher glycemic index than complex carbohydrates, though not always. Proteins and fats have a lower glycemic index because they don't make your blood sugar go up as fast. But so those things are they're real and they're consequential, but there's also a lot of variation from one person to the next as far as that goes. And it's not necessarily there's a lot of negativity and shaming and things like that tend to go on around those things that are not really helpful at all. And that people are always going to be in different states of health, and even within a state of health, there are a lot of different ways that a person can look, and different weights that people can have and things like that. So So if you're working with somebody on their diet, it's important to, keep positive regard, not try to use shaming or anything like that. And also, it's for the most part something that it's probably not good to give advice about unless asked, because a lot of people have just kind of had enough of unsolicited advice on the matter. But yeah, in my practice, I don't really focus on weight loss at all. I focus on trying to live a healthy lifestyle and have a diet that's supportive to good health, and kind of see where things go from there. Um, and if somebody has an imbalance, like with their blood sugar or something like that, then try and address that specifically. And that's not always a result, or at least it's not a consistent result in any way of a particular diet. You know, two people can eat very similar diets and one of them end up with type 2 diabetes and one of them not, or one of them end up overweight and one of them not. And you know, there are just so many variables in human metabolism that it's not a good idea to draw any sort of one-to-one correspondence, um, and especially not to assign any sort of moral value or virtuousness to the fact that somebody's, you know, thin or in good health or anything like that, because you know, there's just so many variables that could have made things worse or that could make things better, and so forth. Uh, yeah, usually when people are eating in real life, you know, they don't just eat rice, they don't just eat beans, and they don't just eat oil. Certainly, they, you know, maybe combine all three of those things together, and you're getting close to something that a person could eat. But you know, usually there's a lot of other things that go into it. With carbohydrates, grains are a source of carbohydrates. Seeds usually contain carbohydrates as well as do fruits. Fruits usually contain sugars, specifically sugars and fiber. Sometimes they contain complex carbohydrates and sometimes not. But root vegetables are also another source, and traditionally they're a pretty big source of carbohydrates. And even in more traditional ways of cooking, like pre-supermarket food ways, you'll see a lot of root vegetables. You'll see a lot of things like turnips, sweet potatoes, white potatoes, russet potatoes. They're kind of a different thing. I don't exactly consider them root vegetables, even though they grow underground. But with carrots and beets and turnips and sweet potatoes, there's a lot of fiber. There's a lot of the structural parts of the plant, the structural tissue of the plant. In other words, the vascular tissue of the plant. It's also true of onions, and similar underground vegetables, which are really an underground part of the stem and leaves. But they contain starches. And they also contain vascular plant tissue, you know, stringy, fibery stuff. So those absorb into your system more slowly, and they also provide more substrate for gut bacteria. And so those are kind of, in a way, a less hard-hitting form of carbohydrates. And you know, even though they don't keep year-round the way that grains do, they're something that if you're out gathering your own food in the forest, for instance, or even growing your own food in the garden, they're a thing that you can kind of produce a lot more of a lot more easily compared to grains. You can grow a lot of grains if you have a plow and if you're able to, you know, till the soil in the way that grains like, and you have the right kind of soil. But you know, not that many people are out there planting wheat or even rye in their garden, because it has to kind of be done. It has to kind of be done at scale, at a certain scale, for it to be worth doing at all. And that scale is not an individual scale for the most part. I mean, it can be if you have machinery, of course, but historically, it would be something more like a group of people growing grain together and individual people doing more gardening and foraging, fishing, whatever, to round out their diet, but getting most of their nutrition from leaves, roots, nuts, berries, things like that, which tend to be less nutrient dense. They tend to be less calories per pound, or calories per gram, or whatever you want to say, compared to some more modern foods like the beans and rice, or some more, not even modern, because people have been growing beans and rice for thousands of years, but they're foods that are more like the foods of civilization rather than the foods of, or foods of people who live in larger groups rather than the foods of people who live and produce their foods in smaller groups. They're commodities, whereas garden vegetables are less like a commodity and more like something that would be produced on an individual scale. So there's this whole social aspect to nutrition that's really huge. And, you know, there is a traditional, let's say, there is a lot of traditional associations between certain foods and status, like getting the best cuts of meat and having them as steak rather than ground beef, or, you know, eating beef at all instead of chicken and rabbit, which can be grown on much smaller parcels of land. And so you have, you know, this whole socioeconomic aspect of nutrition that often isn't necessarily as directly relevant to people anymore, but it still influences how people eat some of the time and what foods they consider desirable. The foods that have been historically higher status tend to be still considered more desirable, or sometimes considered more desirable and more sought after. And a lot of things that used to be maybe a once in a while type of treat, like white bread, have become, you know, more like an everyday type of thing for people, in a way that's not as beneficial for them. It's not necessarily something that should be eaten all the time. And of course, things that used to be seasonal are often available year round now as well, as far as produce goes, because we have food being brought in from far away, which wasn't really possible until the middle of the 20th century. Wasn't really very practical at all to do, because you didn't have the roadways. Even once you had motor vehicles in the early 20th century, you didn't have the roadways, and you didn't have the distribution centers and 18-wheelers and everything like that for it to be a very common thing. So, you know, I could probably go out to the store and buy a watermelon right now in January, which would have been just, you know, you couldn't, I think that when my grandparents were kids, you couldn't have gone out and got a watermelon in January for love or money. There just weren't any, or if there were any, they were thousands of miles away, and you just couldn't get to where they were. So, you know, that's something that has changed a lot. Foodways in general have changed a lot in a few generations. And that's, you know, left people sort of unmoored, sort of at sea as far as knowing what makes sense for them to eat. A couple of places that I've seen this in my own life, in Eastern Kentucky, when I was young, the people who were old Well, the people who were very old when I was very young were from the 1800s. The people who were just kind of old when I was just kind of young were, they'd grown up during the Depression. And both of those groups of people would really look at something like white bread and bologna as being a high status food, because it was, you didn't used to be able to get it so easily. And if you were, butchering your own hogs, you weren't making anything like bologna out of them, And so being able to get something like that very readily seemed very, posh to them, in a way that it didn't to me even back then. I didn't really question it as being bad food or anything, but to them it was like, ooh, this is the fancy processed stuff, and it wasn't necessarily that good for you. And so that there had been this, because of the availability of things had changed, stuff that would have once been considered a treat had become an everyday thing. And that was not necessarily as good of food as, say, the beans and cornbread, maybe with a little bit of bacon in it, that they had been eating when they were, growing up, that had a lot more fiber and a lot less of the simple carbohydrates, and maybe less fat, less salt, things like that as well. Another place that I've seen a similar series of changes happen was when I was in Central Asia. I went to a village that used to be on the Aral Sea. And the Aral Sea was an inland sea of basically a large saltwater lake that was fed by rivers, and the rivers got diverted for irrigation before they got to this inland sea. And so the inland sea started drying up and eventually basically dried all the way up and died. But in between, I talked to someone who had grown up there and was an old man in the 1990s. And he told me about how when he was a young person, everything that they had was made right there. It was like a tribal type of situation. Everybody was related to each other. They lived in this village that was up on stilts out in the lake, like a dock with little houses on it and things. And they fished from little boats, little kayaks, and smoked and salted the fish and ate them, and that's what they lived off of. And then in the 1920s or so, the Soviet Union came and industrialized everything, had giant cannery ships out on this lake, catching fishes in commercial quantities, processing them and canning them on the ships, and then selling them elsewhere. And so people went from being this not really agrarian, but like a very traditional society, to being a more industrial society. And then the lake dried up and it became a completely collapsed society, where they were, basically reliant on government assistance to even survive, and having, foods brought in from elsewhere that were like preserved foods and things like that. So it went from everything either being fresh or fermented or preserved in traditional ways, to being canned, commodified, and then being just sort of like being a more collapsed system, where they were just getting humanitarian relief type food, rather than anything that anyone would eat that had much of a choice about it. So was a much kind of a big turn for the worse in a way. Ultimately, like in the middle, it kind of felt better and more prosperous to them, and like they were moving into the modern times. And then by the end of it, it was like everything was sort of yanked out from under them. And so this person, most of the people had left, but this guy was old and he wasn't going to leave, and he had a granddaughter that he took care of, and I guess she was not going anywhere either, at least until she was old enough to on her own. So that was another example of how quickly people's ways of life, and with it their ways of food, have changed over the course of the last few generations. I mean, I would say within living memory, but it's probably a little bit outside of living memory by now. Or if that guy were still alive, he'd be close to 100 probably, or maybe he'd be more than that. But there are probably some people alive who can remember before it got industrialized, but not very many. So yeah, it's that we've seen huge changes in our food ways and in our ways of getting our food energy and our macronutrients over the course of the last few generations, to the extent that a lot of people don't really have a very clear concept of what a human diet is supposed to look like. What was the name of the sea? The sea was called the Aral Sea, Aral. And that was in Kazakhstan, but the sea also was partly in Uzbekistan. Yeah, it used to be one of the biggest lakes in the world, and now it's basically gone. There's some salt marshes in some place that used to be part of it, and there's giant cannery ships laying on their side in the desert and that sort of thing. Apparently a lot of the area around it used to be forest as well, and so the weather patterns there have changed completely because there's not the water evaporating and then raining back down.
That story is so sad.
I'm sorry. Yeah, it's that's the short version of it. It's even sadder than that, really. But
Oh
I don't
no.
want to get into all that. But yeah. I mean, it is really tragic that the industrialization of the food system has really caused a lot of destruction. And when we think about development, we often think about urban sprawl and things like that, but there's a lot of habitat destruction for the sake of growing crops or for the sake of grazing particular types of animals and stuff as well. So yeah, it can be pretty bad. But yeah, so I always encourage people when they're thinking about what humans should eat is to think about what you would do if there wasn't a grocery store. What would you be eating then? What would you grow in a garden if you were going to garden all your own food? And that sort of thing. What would you eat if you were a gnome that lived in the forest? Maybe as a thought experiment, you can kind of think about those sorts of things and think about what food is like in a less commodified situation, in a less, and by commodified, I mean like everything is bought and sold rather than being something that you produce yourself. And usually, bought and sold multiple times rather than just you buying something, maybe at the farmer's market, you buy food from people who grew it. Although some of that stuff is brought in from Florida in boxes and then they sell it. So not always, but if you go to the store, you're probably buying food that you're buying it from the store, and the store bought it from a wholesaler, and the wholesaler bought it from maybe a packager or maybe directly from the farm. And so it's, changed hands 2 or 3 times before it gets to you. And that doesn't necessarily make it any worse or less nutritious, but it does make it harder for some people to figure out, what's a reasonable thing to eat, what's a reasonable amount of food to eat, what's a reasonable amount of any particular food to eat. And so, looking at the numbers and the labels and things like that can be something of a guide to that. I'm sort of an impulsive label reader. I like to really read the labels on foods and know what I'm getting from the food and have a good sense of it. And after a while, you kind of get used to it. After a while, you get to where you can sort of eyeball calories and other nutrients like that, just because you've seen similar things enough times. But yeah, I like to know what's in food and what areas that I might be getting enough or not from. And when I'm working with other people and I want to encourage mindfulness about what they're eating, sometimes I'll have them keep a food diary. And a lot of the time they won't do this very faithfully, and that's okay too. But what I'm trying to do mostly is get them to think about what they're eating and get them to kind of be at least aware of how much they're eating and whether they're getting enough calories, whether they're getting a reasonable amount of protein and stuff like that. Because people don't necessarily know, and appetite is not necessarily a reliable guide for that sort of thing. Sometimes people will not be hungry and they'll think that they're eating, I'm eating 3 meals a day and I'm not hungry, so I'm probably getting plenty of calories and food. But then if you have them keep track of it, maybe they're only getting a fraction of what they need sometimes. Sometimes they might be getting more. And, it's not done. This isn't intended as an exercise. I don't ever intend this to be like a self-limiting thing, like make sure you only eat this or that. I always intend it to just be a matter of awareness and mindfulness and, knowing what you're eating and how much you're eating so that you can make sensible choices about it. Yeah, somebody says if something has more than 5 ingredients, I try not to eat it. I often, I don't always stick to something like that, but I prefer foods that are very simple, in terms of what's in them. I like preparing food. Some people hate it. I really, I don't always feel like I have a lot of time to put into it the way I want to. So sometimes I make things that are really easy, but I like the process of making food. I think that it feels good to be able to feed people. And if I lived alone, I might not do it as much. But I like being able to make food for people. And I like, starting from basics, rather than starting from something that's already processed or already made. But, different things work for different people depending on what their energy level is and what their time availability and resources and everything are. But yeah, I think it's really wonderful to be able to eat wholesome, whole foods where you know what you're eating. I think, a friend of mine who was a homeless person one time said that one of his main rules was always know what you're eating. And I think that that's kind of something that I've tried to keep in mind a lot. And another one is this thing that my mom used to say to me all the time when I was a really little kid was to don't put that in your mouth that you don't know where it's been. And I feel that way about food now. I don't really want to put something in my mouth if I don't know where it came from. And there's a lot of food out there there's a lot of edible things out there that, don't have any recognizable components. Like if you get something like a Twinkie, you can't really look at a Twinkie and tell what it's made of. Some kind of flour, it's sticky, so there's sugar. There's this white stuff in there. You might think it's cream, but it's not actually dairy based or anything. It's like sugar and zinc oxide or something weird like that. So yeah, things like that I tend to avoid pretty completely. But also, I'm really not very dogmatic about food either. Like, if somebody invited me over to their house and they offered me a Twinkie, I'd probably eat it to be polite. And it's what you do occasionally isn't really what's going to trip you up usually. It's what you do all the time. And so I feel like if you, generally eat a good diet and things like that, and once in a while you want to eat something like, a cheeseburger from a fast food place or something like that, if it's a once in a while thing, it's not really going to make you fall over dead or anything like that. If you do it all the time, you can expect that it's going to take its toll on your kidneys, on your heart, things like that. So that's not a matter of trying to say that one food is more virtuous than another or anything, but it's some things are just going to be harder on your system. And I think that, it's really about establishing good habits and establishing working within a reasonable frame. Because I think one of the wonderful things about human diet is, and this is part of why people are confused about what they should eat, but it is also a really good positive thing as well, is that humans are made to be able to run on whatever's available. We're kind of scavengers. We can eat a lot of different things and get by okay. Fresh fruits and vegetables and things like that are probably going to be a lot better for us in some ways than some other foods. But if you have to get by on just rice, you can do it for quite a while. If you have to get by on, just pizza for a while, you could probably do that, depending on individual dietary needs and so forth. But we're made to be able to get by on quite a variety of things and to adapt to quite a variety of things. But I think that not being at any sort of an extreme diet is a really good position to be in, where you're eating a variety of different things and you're not necessarily relying too heavily on any one source of calories or any one source of fats or any one source of proteins. Because there are, even within these categories of carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, they're not monolithic categories. There are lots of different fats out there. And you get slightly different fats from olive oil than you get from sunflower oil. And you get slightly different fats from coconut oil. And while your body is capable of breaking down these fats and reconstructing them into each other, into different types of fats, it's not, it might be easier for you to not have to do that, to not have to do as much conversion to it. So getting as many forms of, as many sources of fat, as many sources of amino acids, as many sources of different types of carbohydrates as are available to you is a really good idea, generally speaking. All right. So next time I'm going to be talking more about specific micronutrients, things that we need in small, chemicals that are in foods that we need in small quantities, like vitamins, like minerals, and a few other things. And so that's, sort of an area that might have a little more, it's dealing a little more with specific substances rather than the big picture type of thing. But a lot of my recommendations for that would be the same too, is that you get micronutrients by eating a varied and balanced diet. All right, any questions about that? A second. It's a question about blue cohosh. So for blue cohosh as part of a fertility approach, how many months of 14 days on, 14 off might someone try this? A year or so. I mean, usually it can take a while for things to really change, because just because even if you are having like regular menstrual cycles getting to happen, that doesn't necessarily mean ovulation is happening. Even if ovulation is happening, that doesn't necessarily mean that all the other hormonal cycles that tend to go along with it are happening the way they should need to. So, I always tell people at least 3 months, but sometimes 12, because it can be pretty variable for different people. But usually somewhere in the 3 to 12 month range.
I don't have a question so much as something funny to share that
Okay.
you reminded me of. I literally saw dandelion greens for sale at the grocery store, and I
Okay.
almost lost it because I thought, oh, sure, let's all spray our yards and kill this weed, and then we'll go buy it at the grocery store.
Right.
And I just thought that was the strangest thing I've ever seen in the grocery store in a while.
Right. That's interesting. But yeah, that's they're good food, they're just most people don't think of them as food, strangely
They're
enough.
delicious and they're wonderful. And I mean, I'm glad, maybe, sort of,
Right.
kind of, but then I'm just kind of like, dang,
Glad
just
they're
go eat
available,
some.
yeah. But
Right.
right, not everybody has a yard they can get them out of, but it's a good thing to be able to get out of your yard. And I just want to plant a big garden bed full of dandelions, But yeah, they're good food, and they're something that I feel like more people should be eating on a regular basis.
I want more dandelions too. I can't get enough of dandelions, but do you know how hard it is to actually find actual, like, you would think you wouldn't need to like buy seeds, but for whatever reason, I don't know if it's where I live up on a hill and it's windy all the time, I don't get a whole lot of dandelions, and it makes me sad.
Oh, interesting. Well, all right. I will see you all next week, and hope that everyone is well from now until then.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.